I'll Teach You Forever by Miriam C. Hood Riley, an adaptation of Robert Munsch's story, Love You Forever. On the first day of a new school year, as a third grade teacher welcomed her new class, she paced back and forth, back and forth, back and forth among the students, and she sang, I'll teach you forever, I'll love you always, as long as I'm living, my students you will be. The students learned and they learned and they learned. They learned until they were no longer third grade students. They learned about science, math, social studies, and reading until they had no more third grade to learn. As they learned, their teacher would pace back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. While she paced, she sang, I'll teach you forever. I'll love you always. As long as I'm living, my students you will be. The students read all her books, played all her games. They even made mistakes. Sometimes the teacher would say, these students are driving me crazy. On Fridays, as the students took their test, the teacher would look over their shoulder, smile, and pace back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and in a very low voice she would sing, I'll teach you forever. I'll love you always. As long as I'm living, my students you will be. The students learned and learned and learned. They learned until it was time to go to fourth grade. She never wanted them to leave, but they had played, made mistakes, made growth, and learned, and it was time for them to go. As the students were getting their report cards, the teacher paced back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. She sang in a very low voice, I'll teach you forever. I'll love you always. As long as I'm living, my students you will be. As the students went on to fourth grade and fifth grade, the teacher would keep up with their behavior, their goals, their growth, their triumphs, and their mistakes. She would stop and talk to them each day, asking about their families, how they liked the next grade, and what they were learning. She asked them their thoughts and their opinions, and on each Friday, as the students took their test, the teacher would stand outside their classroom and watch them work. As she watched how hard they were working, she would pace back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and in a very low voice, she would sing, I'll teach you forever. I'll love you always. As long as I'm living, my students you will be. Finally, it was time for the students to leave their elementary school and go to middle school. The teacher was sad. She had seen groups of students come and go, but this group of students held a very special place in her heart. As the students walked across the stage at their fifth grade graduation ceremony, the teacher stood in the back of the auditorium, and she paced back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. In a very low voice, she sang, I'll teach you forever. I'll love you always. As long as I'm living, my students you will be. As time passed, many more groups of students came through her classroom, many students that she loved, but none ever held a spot like these students did. It seemed like it was just yesterday when they were in third grade, but now it was time for them to graduate from high school. The teacher had received many invitations to these students' graduation, and since they were all graduating from the same high school, she attended their ceremony. As she stood in the back of the auditorium and watched her students, which she always called her babies, walk across the stage, tears of sadness filled her eyes. Tears of sadness because she knew this would be the last time she would see them. She also had tears of joy because all of her students were graduating. As she watched them, she paced back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. In a very low voice, she sang, I'll teach you forever. I'll love you always. As long as I'm living, my students you will be. Time passed and new students came and went, and the teacher grew older and older. She was no longer a young teacher, and she decided it was time to retire. The teacher had been teaching for over 45 years, so the school decided to give her a retirement party. Many of her former students came to tell her goodbye and to thank her for loving them, but the teacher was saddened because a group of students that held a special spot in her heart were not there, not one. As the teacher said her last farewell, took her last box to her car, she walked to her classroom for one last look. As she turned on the lights, took a look around at her room, the room that had been her home away from home for the past 45 years, she heard a low, sweet hum. She stepped into the hallway, and there, to her surprise, was the class of students that she loved so much, and they began to pace back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, in a very low voice that grew louder and louder as they sang. You taught us forever. You loved us always. As long as we're living, your students we will be. As the students continued to pace back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, they sang a new verse. They sang, we'll miss you forever. We'll love you always. As long as we're living, our favorite teacher you will be. The end.